had no business being out there on a night like that. The rain had started in a light drizzle that misted over the windshield, but it had quickly turned into a relentless downpour, hammering against the glass like 1,000 tiny fists. I was gripping the steering wheel too tight, knuckles pale under the dim glow of the dashboard lights. The wipers worked overtime, swiping at the rain, but it was never enough. The road was barely visible, just the vague outline of gravel and dirt stretching ahead, winding through the thick, dark forest. I had taken the wrong turn over an hour ago. The signs were unfamiliar, the road too narrow, and my phone had lost service miles back. There was no way to pull over, no real shoulder, just a steep drop on one side and dense trees on the other. So I pressed on, hoping I'd find a place to turn around or, better yet, a main road. But the deeper I drove, the worse it got. The rain made the surface slick, and my headlights barely cut through the thick mist that was beginning to roll in. Then, without warning, the engine cut out. The sudden silence hit me like a punch to the gut. The hum of the motor, the faint static of the radio, gone. The power flickered, then died completely. No headlights, no dashboard lights, just darkness and the sound of rain beating down on the car. My breath hitched as I turned the key in the ignition. Nothing. Dead. I cursed under my breath, gripping the wheel as I tried again. Still nothing. The car wasn't even trying to turn over. Just silence. Part of me wanted to stay inside, wait it out, but I knew better. I was in the middle of nowhere, no phone signal, no clue where I was. The only option was to walk. I grabbed my jacket from the passenger seat, pulling it over me before stepping out into the storm. The rain was colder than I expected, instantly soaking through the thin material. My boots squelched against the muddy ground as I started forward. I didn't know where I was going, but anywhere was better than standing next to a dead car in the middle of nowhere. The road stretched ahead, vanishing into the mist. I walked for what felt like hours, the rain never letting up. My clothes clung to me, heavy and wet, my breath coming in short gasps. My feet ached, but I kept moving. Then I heard it, a noise behind me. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I saw the glow of dim headlights cutting through the mist. A car was coming, moving slowly, almost hesitantly. Relief flooded through me. I turned, raising a hand to wave it down, but as the vehicle approached, something felt off. The headlights were faint, barely illuminating the road. The engine made no sound, just the soft hum of tires rolling against wet gravel. The closer it got, the more my stomach twisted. Something was wrong. The car rolled to a stop beside me. Without thinking, I reached out, fingers wrapping around the back door handle. I yanked it open and climbed in, desperate to get out of the rain. My body was shaking, breath ragged. I slammed the door shut and wiped the water from my face before looking up. There was no one in the driver's seat, no one in the passenger seat, no one at all. The car was empty. My body locked up, my breath catching in my throat. The car was still moving, creeping forward at the same slow pace. My pulse pounded in my ears as I twisted, scanning the dark interior. No keys in the ignition, no sign of life, just the low hum of the tires against the wet road. Panic took hold. I reached for the door handle, ready to throw myself out, but then I saw it. The lights of a village in the distance. Buildings, street lights, signs of civilization. My heart leaped. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing. I had to get out of that car. The moment we rolled into the village, I grabbed the handle and threw myself out, landing hard on the wet pavement. My legs barely held me as I scrambled to my feet and bolted toward the first building I saw, a pub. The warm glow of its windows was the most welcoming sight I'd ever seen. I burst through the door, panting, soaked to the bone. The few patrons inside turned to look at me, but I didn't care. I stumbled to the bar, gripping the edge as I tried to catch my breath. The bartender raised an eyebrow but said nothing as I motioned for a drink. My hands were still shaking when he slid a glass toward me. Then the door creaked open again. 2 men stepped inside, both soaked from head to toe. One was tall and broad-shouldered, the other shorter, stockier. Their clothes clung to them, water dripping onto the wooden floor. The taller one scanned the room before his eyes locked onto me. For a moment, no one spoke. Then he pointed straight at me. "That's him," he said, his voice carrying through the quiet pub. "That's the bastard who jumped out of the car we were pushing." The words sank in, slow and heavy. My stomach dropped. My mouth went dry. The car. The one I had climbed into, the one that had no driver. They had been pushing it. The room felt suddenly too small, the air thick. My head spun as the pieces fell into place. The engine had been dead. The lights were dim because they were running on the last dregs of battery. No ghost, no phantom driver, just two men pushing their broken-down car in the middle of a storm. And I had panicked like a fool. The taller man shook his head, muttering something under his breath before turning to the bartender. The shorter one just gave me a look, somewhere between amused and annoyed, before following his friend to a table. I sat there, staring at my drink, feeling my face burn hot despite the cold seeping through my soaked clothes. I had never felt so damn stupid in my life. I remember the night I heard the story for the first time. The fire crackled, casting long shadows on the trunks of towering pines. Our scout leader leaned in, his face half lit by the flames, his voice low and deliberate. He told us about a man and his wife, settlers in the early 1800s, traveling westward in search of fortune or, at the very least, a place to call home. They had spent months crossing plains and rivers, enduring heat and storms, until they found it. A stretch of land nestled in a valley, bordered by thick woods and a wide, slow-moving river. It was perfect. The soil was rich, and the land seemed to promise a good future. With winter only a couple of months away, they hurriedly built a rough cabin from logs and mud. It was crude but sturdy enough to last until spring, when they could build something better. At first, they were optimistic. The forest teemed with game, deer, rabbits, squirrels. The river promised fish, and they had enough supplies to last through a tough season. But as the weeks passed and the cold deepened, things changed. The first snowfall came early, coating everything in white. Then came another storm, and another. The wind howled through the trees, and the river froze solid. Hunting became difficult. The animals, once abundant, disappeared. Maybe they had sensed the coming harshness and moved on, or maybe something else had driven them away. Whatever the reason, the traps remained empty, and each hunt ended in failure. They rationed their food, stretching out every meal, but by midwinter, their supplies were gone. The man grew weaker each day, his body thinning, his fingers stiff with cold. His wife suffered more, her face hollowed, her eyes sunk deep into their sockets, her skin stretched tight over her bones. Then came the hunger, not the simple, aching hunger of missing a meal, but the deep, gnawing kind that takes over your mind. It was always there, twisting inside her, clawing at her insides. At night, she would lie awake, her stomach cramping, her mouth dry, her limbs too weak to move. Her husband tried to comfort her, but his voice had no warmth. It was empty, just like their bellies. One morning, he made a decision. If they stayed there, they would die. He would go into the forest and not return until he had found food. He dressed in every scrap of clothing he had, took his musket, and stepped out into the cold. The days that followed were a blur of white. Snow, wind, hunger. He moved slowly, his boots crunching through the ice. He built small fires at night, wrapping himself in a tattered blanket. He waited, he watched, but there was nothing. By the second night, he had begun to give up hope. Then, just as he was about to turn back, he saw it. A rabbit, plump and still, its body trembling against the snow. He raised his musket, took a steady breath, and fired. The shot echoed through the empty woods. The rabbit twitched once, then went still. He rushed forward, scooping it up, feeling its warmth in his hands. Relief flooded him. He had done it. They would eat. With renewed strength, he turned for home, half running through the snow, clutching the rabbit to his chest. His legs burned, his lungs ached, but he didn't stop. He imagined his wife's face when she saw what he had brought. But something was wrong. The moment he stepped into the clearing, he felt it. The cabin was still standing, untouched by the wind, but something inside him screamed that something was off. He stepped onto the porch, his boots knocking against the wood. The door was slightly open. The hinges creaked as he pushed it wider. At first, he thought she was dead. She lay on the floor in front of the cold fireplace, her body still. Then she moved just barely. A twitch of her fingers, a shift of her head. The fire had long since gone out, but the room was still warm. The smell hit him then, coppery and sour. His stomach clenched as his eyes adjusted to the dim light. Her hands, no, not hands, bones. Her fingers were nothing but bone, stripped clean of flesh. The raw ends gleamed in the faint light. The jagged remains of her wrists, where the skin had been chewed away, glistened red. She had eaten them. His mind refused to accept it. He took a step forward, and she moved again, turning her head toward him. Her lips, gone. Her teeth, bare and exposed, stretched into something that wasn't quite a smile. A grotesque, open-mouthed grin of raw, pink gums. She opened her mouth wider, clicking her teeth together, the sound dry and hollow. Her jaw worked up and down, gnashing, biting at the air. She was hungry. His breath came in ragged gasps. The rabbit slipped from his fingers, landing on the wooden floor with a soft thud. Her head jerked toward the sound. Her shoulders twitched, and then she lunged. He stumbled back, his boots slipping on the floor. She scrambled forward, her bony hands clawing at the ground, dragging her wasted body toward him. Her teeth snapped together, a sickening sound, her breath coming in short, frantic gasps. He turned and ran. The cold air burned his throat as he stumbled through the snow, not daring to look back. Behind him, he heard the scraping, the dry clatter of bones on wood, the choked, desperate sounds of something that had once been human. The river was frozen solid. He ran across it, the ice cracking beneath his feet, his heart hammering in his chest. He didn't stop until he reached the trees, until he could no longer hear the gnashing of her teeth. He didn't stop running for a long, long time. The man never went back. Not for his belongings, not for the rabbit, not even to bury what was left of his wife. He made it to a trading post weeks later, half-starved and barely able to speak. When they asked him what had happened, he never answered. He simply sat by the fire, staring at the flames, his hands shaking. Years later, when others passed through that valley, they found the cabin still standing. The door hung open, the inside empty. But near the fireplace, they found scratches on the wooden floor, deep, jagged marks, as if something had been dragged across it over and over again. And just outside, half buried in the snow, they found bones. Human, stripped clean. I worked as a camp counselor for a few summers in the late 90s. It was a small summer camp in the woods of northern Minnesota, nestled by a lake, the kind of place where the water was so still at night that it looked like black glass, and the trees creaked even when there was no wind. It was my job to keep the kids entertained, make sure no one drowned, and keep their minds off the fact that they were in a strange place away from home. One of the best ways to keep kids engaged was with ghost stories. Every counselor had one. Some were the classics. The man with the hook hand, the girl who disappeared in the woods, the ghostly camper who still roamed the trails. But I had my own story, and it always hit harder than the others. Because at the end of it, I had proof. I would always tell my story on the last night of the session. The kids were tired by then, but still buzzing with the excitement of the week. We'd gather around the campfire, the flames flickering just enough to cast long shadows across our faces. The other counselors knew the drill. They'd stay quiet, letting me do my thing. I'd take a deep breath, stare into the fire for a moment, then start talking in a low voice. There's a story they don't put in the camp brochures, a story they don't want you to know, that always got their attention. The fidgeting stopped, the whispering faded, and all eyes turned to me. Years ago, before this was a camp, before the cabins and the trails and the canoes, this land belonged to someone else. A man who didn't want to leave. A man who made sure people remembered his name one way or another. No one knows exactly how he died, but they say he was betrayed by his own brother, left to die in the cold with no one to hear him scream. But he didn't just disappear. He made a deal, a trade. I'd let the words settle, let the quiet press in around us. They say if he comes to you in the dark, if you hear him whisper your name, you have one chance to survive. You have to give him something, a piece of yourself, 2 of your teeth. At this point, some kids would laugh, nervous, unsure. Keep going. If you don't, he takes you. If you do, he leaves you alone, but you have to give him 2 names. 2 names of people he'll take instead. Silence. Always silence. No one believes it, right? But people go missing. People vanish in these woods and no one knows why. Maybe it's just bad luck. Maybe it's something else. I'd lean forward then, let my voice drop even lower. I never believed it either. But when I was a kid, I lost all my baby teeth except 2. They never came in, just gone. When I got older, I had to wear a retainer with 2 fake teeth to fill the gaps. Then I'd pause, slowly, without breaking eye contact with anyone. I'd reach up, pop out the retainer, and smile wide. The look on their faces was always priceless. First, confusion, then realization, then sheer terror. Some would scream, some would scramble backward, some would just stare, their minds trying to make sense of what they were seeing. And that was it. That was all I needed to do. I'd slide the retainer back in, grin, and say, "All right, time for bed." It scared them every time. And I never had to make anything up. That was the best part. I never had those teeth. They just never grew in. No ghost, no curse. Just bad genetics and a weird coincidence that made for a hell of a campfire story. But the weirdest thing? One year after the kids had all gone to bed, one of the other counselors came up to me. He was pale, looked genuinely shaken. I thought maybe he just wasn't into scary stories, that he'd gotten spooked along with the kids. He pulled me aside, out of earshot of the others. "That story," he said, "where'd you hear it?" I shrugged. "Made it up." "Well, most of it." He shook his head. "No, man. My uncle told me almost the same story when I was a kid. He swore it was real. Except," he swallowed, eyes darting toward the woods. "Except the version he told me? It wasn't just 2 teeth. It was the whole mouth." I laughed it off, told him he was messing with me, but he didn't laugh. He didn't say anything else. Just walked off, still pale, still shaken. I never forgot that. And the next summer, that counselor, he didn't come back. Quit right before the season started. No one ever heard from him again. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe he found another job, moved away, started a new life. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is too quiet, I think about it. About the way he looked at me, about the fear in his voice. And I wonder, if I hadn't told that story, if I hadn't put those names out into the world, would I still have my teeth? I don't remember the first time I heard the story. It must have been sometime in the late 90s, sitting around the fire at summer camp, deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. The kind of place where the trees stretch high enough to block out the stars, and the nights are so dark you can't see your hand in front of your face. The story always started the same way. A man was found in the woods, not too far from where we sat, his body fresh, barely a few hours cold. He was a large man, burly, maybe a logger or a hunter. The way they described him, he must have been someone who could take care of himself. But whoever or whatever got to him didn't give him a chance. His throat had been slashed, a quick, brutal kill. But that wasn't the part that made the story stick. What made it terrifying was his left hand. 3 fingers were missing, his pointer, ring, and pinky. The authorities searched the area, expecting to find the missing fingers nearby, maybe chewed up by scavengers or buried under leaves. But there was nothing, just the body and a mystery. The case went cold within days. The woods had a way of swallowing things, even people. A few weeks later, it happened again. A second body. This man was smaller than the first, thinner, younger, maybe mid-30s. Same cause of death. Same missing fingers. Again, the search turned up nothing. The police started looking for connections between the victims, but they found nothing. No family ties, no shared acquaintances, no reason for them to die the same way, in the same place. Then came the third body. This time it was a woman, mid-20s, blonde, athletic build. Another quick, clean kill, and another 3 fingers missing from her left hand. And the victims kept getting smaller. A college kid, then a high schooler, then a 12-year-old boy. Each one just a little smaller than the last. And every time those same fingers were missing, the police were in over their heads. The killings didn't fit any known pattern. No ransom, no signs of struggle, no clear motive. It was just death and missing fingers like some twisted trophy system. And then something changed. The last body they found belonged to a teenage girl. But instead of 3 missing fingers, she only had 2, her ring and pinky. This time, the police got lucky. They found something. A partial fingerprint left on her wrist. Barely visible, but enough to run through their database. The print belonged to the previous victim. The boy. That changed everything. The cops started working backward, checking the bodies for prints, DNA, anything they might have missed. It turned out each victim had left some kind of trace on the next one, like they'd been forced to participate in their own replacement. That was the theory anyway. The news never reported most of this. The town didn't want to scare people away, but word got around. The killer was looking for something, trying to replace what they had lost. And they were getting desperate. That's when the guy telling the story would take off his glove. Every year at camp, without fail, we'd hear the same story. And every year, the storyteller, whoever it was, would pull off a ratty old work glove to reveal a mangled left hand, a scarred, barely functioning pointer finger, and a missing ring and pinky. He'd let the firelight catch the ruined skin, give us just enough time to let our stomachs twist in horror, and then he'd lunge. Every year, kids screamed. Some ran, others cried. And then, when the panic started to settle, he'd laugh. Just a cruel, guttural sound that echoed into the trees. "I lost them in an accident," he'd say, flexing his ruined hand. "Doctors saved the pointer. The other 2, gone for good." The story was bullshit. Of course, we all knew that. Just another scary story to keep kids from wandering too far into the woods at night. But sometimes, late at night, when the fire had burned low and the sounds of the forest crept in close, you couldn't help but wonder. Because every year, no matter who told the story, it was always the same hand. Always the same fingers missing. Always the same scars. And some of those storytellers, they weren't old enough to have been in any kind of accident. Some of them looked like they had just gotten their new fingers. We set up camp in the late afternoon, deep in the woods of Western Oregon. It was early fall, crisp but not too cold, the kind of weather that made a fire necessary but not miserable without one. There were 4 of us, me, my dad, my Uncle Mike, and my cousin Danny. We'd been camping together plenty of times before, but this spot was new. My dad had heard about it from a guy at work, said it was quiet, secluded, good for hunting and fishing. Sounded perfect. By the time we got the tents up and the fire going, the sun was dipping below the trees. The woods were thick here, darker than I was used to, the kind of dark that made it hard to see more than a few feet past the fire. We cooked some food, drank a few beers, at least the adults did, told some stories. It was a good night, until the first rock hit the fire. It wasn't big, just enough to make a sharp crack as it bounced off the burning logs and landed in the dirt. We all stopped talking. My dad shone his flashlight out past the edge of the clearing. Nothing. Probably just something falling from a tree, we figured. Maybe an animal knocked it loose. We went back to talking. Then another rock. And another. These weren't falling from trees. The flashlight beams cut through the darkness, sweeping back and forth over the trees. Still nothing. It was dead silent, too. No wind. No crickets. Just the sound of the fire crackling and the occasional plop of embers shifting. Then I saw them. Eyes. 2 red pinpricks reflecting back at me from high up in the trees. Higher than any animal I knew should be. They didn't move. just stared. I nudged my dad and pointed. He saw them too. "What the hell?" he muttered. Then the eyes disappeared, just blinked out like they were never there. The rocks stopped after that. The forest stayed quiet. After a while, we figured whatever it was had lost interest, so we put more wood on the fire and tried to enjoy the rest of the night. But the fun was gone. None of us said it out loud, but we all felt it. Something was out there, watching. Eventually, we turned in. I've always been a light sleeper, and so was my dad. We were the only ones who woke up around 5 in the morning when we heard the footsteps. Slow, heavy, coming from just outside the tent. I held my breath. The air smelled awful, like rotting meat and wet fur. I could hear my dad shift next to me, his breathing tense. Then he grabbed the side of the tent and shook it hard. "Get the fuck out of here," he barked. Whatever it was took off, crashing through the trees like a damn freight train. We waited, listening, but it didn't come back. When the sun came up, we found footprints in the dirt. Big ones, way too big to be human. And that smell still lingered, faint but there. We didn't stick around to figure out what it was. We packed up fast, barely speaking, and got the hell out of there. None of us ever went back to that spot. We never talked about it much after, either. What was there to say? We didn't know what it was, and maybe it was better that way. The heat was already settling in for the day, even though the sun had barely cleared the tops of the pine trees. I kicked at the dirt as I walked, my boots scuffing against the packed earth of the trail. I hadn't meant to storm off from camp, but sometimes I just needed space. We had been out here for 3 days already, and while I loved camping, my patience for Matt's smart remarks had run dry. He thought he was funny, always making little jokes at my expense, always knowing just how to press my buttons. So I had grabbed my water bottle, stuffed my pocket knife in my shorts, and told him I was going for a walk. I didn't have any real destination in mind. The trail was well-worn but not overly maintained, the kind of path used more by animals than people. I liked it that way. It made me feel like I was alone in the world, just me and the forest. The trees stretched high above me, their needles rustling in the warm morning breeze. The air smelled like pine sap and dry earth. Birds flitted between branches, their calls breaking up the quiet. I walked for what felt like a mile before stopping to take a drink. The trail had started to slope upward, and I could feel the sun pressing harder against my back. I wiped the sweat from my forehead and glanced behind me. I could still hear the distant hum of cicadas, but the campsite was long out of sight. Good, I thought. I just needed a little more time to myself. I adjusted the strap of my water bottle and kept going, stepping over the occasional fallen branch. The trees started thinning a little, the thick forest giving way to a more open landscape. I figured if I went much farther, I'd start hitting scrubland. It was a strange mix out here. Forest on one side, dry desert on the other. That's when I saw him. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. A shape moved along the path ahead, and I slowed my pace. My heart picked up a little. I wasn't used to seeing other people this deep into the trails, especially not this early. But there he was, clear as day, walking toward me, and he was completely naked. My brain took a second to catch up. My first thought was that maybe he had been swimming somewhere and lost his clothes. Maybe he was in trouble. But as he got closer, I could tell that wasn't the case. He didn't look lost or panicked. He was just walking, like it was the most normal thing in the world. He was older, maybe in his late 50s, with leathery skin and a wiry frame. His face was set in a neutral expression, almost like he was deep in thought. He didn't make eye contact, didn't react at all when he saw me, just kept walking, his arms swinging slightly at his sides. I froze. My mind raced with questions. Should I say something? Should I turn around? Was he dangerous? He passed within 10 feet of me, never acknowledging I was there. The only sound was the crunch of his bare feet on the dry dirt. I watched him go, my body tense, waiting for some kind of reaction. But there was nothing, just the sound of the wind through the trees, the birds, and the distant hum of insects. When he disappeared around a bend in the trail, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I stood there for a long time, my ears straining for any sign that he might turn back. Nothing. I turned around and started walking back the way I came, faster this time. My heart was still thudding, my skin crawling. I tried to shake the feeling, tried to tell myself it was just some weird old guy who liked to hike naked. But something about it didn't sit right with me. The way he didn't react at all, the way he just kept moving like I wasn't even there. By the time I made it back to camp, Matt was sitting by the fire pit, poking at the ashes from last night's fire. He glanced up when he saw me, a smirk already forming on his face. "Back already?" he asked. "Thought you were gonna go be mad at me for a while." I didn't answer right away. I sat down on the cooler, taking another long drink from my water bottle. My hands were still a little shaky. "What?" Matt said, noticing the look on my face. I hesitated, then finally said, "I just saw some naked guy walking in the woods." Matt blinked, then laughed. "What?" "I'm serious," I said. "Just walking." He didn't even look at me. Matt was still grinning, but I could tell he was waiting for the punchline. "So what did you do?" "I left," I said. "I don't know, man, it was weird." Matt leaned back, shaking his head. "I bet he's from that nudist place down the road." I frowned. "What?" "The nudist place," he repeated. "Like a mile from here. Some kind of resort or whatever. My uncle told me about it. He camped out here once and said he ran into a bunch of them. They just walk around like that, I guess." I stared at him. "You're telling me there's a nudist colony right next to where we're camping, and you didn't think to mention it?" Matt shrugged. "Didn't think it mattered." I sighed and rubbed my face. "Jesus, Matt." He laughed again, shaking his head. "You looked freaked out." "I was freaked out," I admitted. "I thought I was about to get murdered by some backwoods lunatic." "Well," Matt said, still grinning, "guess it's just some backwoods nudist instead." I exhaled sharply, feeling the last of the tension leave my body. It was still weird, still unsettling, but at least it made sense. I reached for the bag of chips next to the cooler, popping it open. Matt watched me for a second, then said, "So, are we just gonna pretend you didn't run away from a naked old man in the woods?" I threw a chip at his head. "Shut up, Matt." It was the summer of 2019 when my husband, Mark, and I decided to take a camping trip to a remote lake in Montana. We had been planning this for months, excited at the prospect of having a secluded campsite right by the water. We had been lucky to snag a reservation at one of the more isolated sites, far removed from the rest of the campground. It sounded perfect at the time. Just us, nature, and the peaceful solitude of the lake. We arrived in the early afternoon, the sun casting long shadows as we set up our tent and fire pit. The lake stretched out in front of us, still and serene, reflecting the deep blue sky above. There was no one else around for what felt like miles. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind and the distant cry of a bird. It was peaceful, exactly what we had hoped for. As evening fell, we cooked over the fire, drank a few beers, and enjoyed the quiet. But as the last light faded from the sky, something about the silence became unsettling. Montana, like much of the Northwest, can be eerily quiet at night, the kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every little sound. The wind had died down completely, and even the insects seemed to hush. Then the headlights appeared. An SUV, dark-colored with tinted windows, slowly crept down the dirt path leading to our site. Mark and I both turned to watch it approach, our relaxed mood instantly evaporating. It wasn't uncommon for people to get lost or turn around near campsites, but something about the way this vehicle moved felt wrong. Too slow, too deliberate. Mark stood up, waving his flashlight as if offering assistance, but the SUV didn't stop. It drove right past us, rolling down closer to the beach. It sat there for about 5 minutes, engine idling, headlights cutting through the darkness. We exchanged nervous glances. This was not normal. "Maybe they're just looking for a spot to fish," I whispered, though I didn't believe it myself. Mark nodded, but his hand tightened around the flashlight. The SUV lingered for another minute before slowly backing up the way it had come. But something about it didn't sit right with either of us. It felt calculated, like they were scouting the area. "We need to pack up," Mark said quietly. I didn't argue. We moved quickly but carefully, gathering our gear and throwing it into the back of the truck. I kept glancing toward the trees, the lake, the road, expecting someone to emerge. Mark kept his flashlight trained on the beach where the SUV had been parked. "They might have dropped someone off," he muttered. The thought sent a shiver through me. The idea that someone could be out there right now, watching us, waiting. The moment we got in the truck, we saw the headlights again. The same SUV was coming back. My heart started pounding as Mark threw the truck into drive. The second our tires hit the dirt road, the SUV sped up behind us. "They're following us," I said, voice tight with panic. "Hold on." Mark pressed the gas, the truck jolting forward. The road was rough, full of dips and sharp turns, but he didn't slow down. We hit 50, 60, 70 miles per hour, the SUV staying right on our tail. Every turn, every bump in the road, I expected to feel their bumper hit ours. The headlights flooded the truck's interior, blindingly bright in the side mirrors. The road wound through a canyon, steep rock walls on either side. If we crashed here, no one would find us for hours, maybe longer. I gripped the door handle, my pulse hammering. "Faster," I urged. Mark nodded, his hands tight on the wheel. We hit 80, the truck rattling over the uneven ground. I stole a glance back. The SUV was still there, but struggling to keep up on the rough terrain. A sudden dip in the road sent us airborne for half a second before slamming back down. The headlights behind us swerved wildly, then vanished. "They lost control," Mark said. "Hold on." We didn't stop. We didn't slow down. We kept driving until we reached the main highway, the paved road feeling impossibly smooth after the chaos of the chase. Only then did Mark finally pull over, breathing hard. I turned to look behind us. Nothing. No lights, no dust cloud, no sign of the SUV. We sat there in silence for a long time. "What the hell was that?" I whispered. Mark shook his head. "I don't know, but we're never camping out here again." We drove straight to the nearest town, found a cheap motel, and locked every possible entrance before finally collapsing onto the bed. Neither of us slept that night. To this day, we don't know what those people wanted or what would have happened if we hadn't left when we did. But we both know, without a shadow of a doubt, that we were being hunted. We were deep in the desert, miles away from the nearest town, surrounded by nothing but rocky hills and saguaro cacti. The kind of place where the night sky was so dark and empty, you could see every star like pinpricks in a black sheet. It was the perfect place to escape, to drink, to tell stories, and to feel completely cut off from the rest of the world. We had done trips like this before, me, my friends Sam, Lucas, and Ryan, just a bunch of 20-somethings looking for adventure. But this one was different. This one I still think about years later. We set up camp just before sunset. The air was cooling off, but the heat from the day still clung to the ground. We had 2 tents, one for me and Ryan, one for Sam and Lucas, pitched on a flat patch of dirt. Our trucks were parked in a semicircle around us, and the fire pit was already roaring by the time the sun disappeared behind the mountains. We cooked up some burgers, cracked open a few beers, and let the quiet settle in around us. There was something peaceful about being out there, something raw. But that peace didn't last long. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The air in the tent was still and quiet, except for Ryan's soft breathing beside me. Then I heard it sniffing, slow, deliberate, right outside the tent. My first thought was that it was a coyote, maybe a javelina sniffing for scraps. Then I remembered we had cleaned up. We always cleaned up. So why was something still here, searching? The sniffing moved. It went to the other tent. I could hear it, low and wet, inhaling deeply right up against the thin fabric. My stomach dropped. Ryan shifted beside me, and I felt his hand find my arm. He was awake too. So was Sam, I realized, because I could hear him barely whispering Lucas's name. We all knew. We all heard it. Then suddenly the sniffing stopped. For a few moments, the only sound was the wind moving through the bushes. Then something rustled. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving toward our coolers. Faint clatter. Whoever or whatever it was going through our stuff. And then Sam's tent unzipped. I held my breath. There was a pause, just a split second, before Sam bolted out. "Hey!" he shouted. The sound was like a gunshot in the silence. He was holding his pistol, aiming it at the darkness. The fire had died down, but the embers still glowed, casting just enough light to see the outline of someone. A man hunched over one of our coolers. Not an animal. A man. He didn't run, not at first. He just stood there, half hidden in the dark, staring. Then, with this slow, almost lazy movement, he straightened up. I saw his face for the first time. Bearded, wild, eyes sunken deep into his skull. He had a look like he had been out here for too long, like he had been wandering. Then, finally, he ran. Sam fired a shot into the air. The crack echoed off the rocks, and the man stumbled, disappearing into the darkness. None of us spoke. We just stood there, staring into the black. Then, all at once, we moved. We grabbed whatever we could, stuffing sleeping bags and gear into our trucks. No one said it, but we all had the same thought: we weren't staying. We drove until we hit the highway, until the desert was behind us and the streetlights of some small town were glowing in the distance. We pulled into a gas station, sat there in silence for a while. No one wanted to be the first to say it. We weren't alone out there. A year passed. We told the story to a few people, but it became one of those things we laughed about over drinks. A weird, creepy night, nothing more. So, like idiots, we went back. This time, we camped smarter. No tents. We slept in the beds of our trucks, thinking it'd be safer. More visibility. If something came near, we'd see it. It was around 3 a.m. when I woke up. A light, bright, to shine straight onto my face. My first instinct was to swear, to ask which one of my friends was screwing around. But something told me not to move. I stayed still, breathing slow, barely opening my eyes. A figure stood at the edge of the campsite, holding a flashlight. He wasn't looking for something. He was looking at us. One by one, he walked to each truck, shining the light into the beds, staring at us while we slept. Or at least while he thought we were asleep. I kept my breathing steady. My girlfriend was next to me, and I could feel how tense she was. I hoped she was pretending too. Across the site, someone snored by the fire: Lucas. The man turned his light on him, watching him for a long time. Then he left, just like that, walked off into the dark, disappearing between the hills. The moment he was gone, I bolted upright, whispering Sam's name, then Ryan's. One by one, my friends stirred. They had been awake too. We packed up in minutes, throwing everything into the trucks, peeling out of there so fast that dust choked the air. None of us spoke until we were miles down the highway. Finally, Sam said what we were all thinking. That was the same guy. I don't know how he found us again. Maybe we weren't as far from the first sight as we thought. Maybe he lived out there, watching, waiting. But I do know one thing: we won't be going back. Ever. It happened in the fall of 2017, deep in the woods of northern Montana. My mom and I had planned a weekend hiking trip, just the two of us and my dog, Bailey. We'd both been craving the crisp mountain air, the kind that carries the scent of damp earth and pine. Bailey, a 3-year-old Labrador mix, was always up for an adventure. She loved hiking as much as we did, maybe more. We'd chosen a lesser-known trail near the Bob Marshall Wilderness. It wasn't a tourist spot, just a narrow path winding through miles of dense forest, a place where the silence felt untouched. No traffic, no human noise, just us and nature. We parked the truck at the trailhead, laced up our boots, and set off, leaving the world behind. Bailey trotted ahead, tail wagging, stopping every so often to sniff at a fallen log or a patch of moss. The first few miles were perfect. Cool air, golden leaves fluttering down like confetti. The path was slightly overgrown but still manageable. We moved at a steady pace, occasionally stopping for water or to admire the views. About an hour in, something changed. The first sign was Bailey. One moment, she was happily leading the way. The next, she froze mid-step. Her ears flattened, her body tensed, and she let out a low, guttural growl. "Bailey," I called, confused. She didn't move. Her eyes locked onto the woods to our left, where the trees were thick and the undergrowth was dense. My stomach tightened. Bailey wasn't a skittish dog. She had never reacted like this before. I looked at my mom, who had stopped beside me. She had the same look I did, concern mixed with sudden awareness. We stood there, listening. First, there was nothing, just the quiet rustling of leaves and the distant creak of trees swaying. Then a sound, a soft, rhythmic crunching, like something moving through the underbrush. Slow, deliberate. It stopped when we stopped. My throat went dry. I scanned the trees, but I saw nothing. The forest felt too still, too watchful. Bailey started shaking. Her leash was wrapped around my wrist, but she strained against it, ears pinned back, hackles raised. She wanted to run. I had to brace myself to keep her from pulling me over. She whimpered, a sound I had never heard from her before. Raw fear. My gut twisted. Something was out there. Mom whispered, "We need to go back." I nodded, my pulse hammering. Slowly, we turned around. Bailey kept trying to bolt, her body tense as a wire. I kept a firm grip, but my hands were sweating, and I was terrified she'd slip away. We walked briskly, but the noise followed. Crunch, pause, then another crunch. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a deer. It was something heavy, something watching us. I had read about mountain lions before. They stalk, they wait, they stay hidden until the perfect moment. I knew that if we ran, we'd trigger a chase instinct. I forced myself to walk normally, but my legs felt weak. Bailey was losing it. She kept trying to drag me forward, desperate to get away. Her breathing was ragged, her muscles coiled like a spring. I had never seen her like this. Then the smell hit me. It was faint but unmistakable. A musky, animal scent, mixed with the sickly sweet rot of something dead. My stomach lurched. Mom must have smelled it too, because she muttered, "Jesus!" The truck was still over a mile away. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew I couldn't. We had to hold it together. We picked up the pace. The sounds kept following. Bailey was pulling so hard I could barely keep control of her. I didn't dare look back. My skin crawled at the thought of something just beyond the trees, watching us. A sudden noise, louder, closer. A snap like a branch breaking under something massive. That's when Bailey lost it. She lunged forward with everything she had. I barely held on, stumbling. My foot caught on a root, and I fell hard, my knee slamming into the dirt. Pain shot up my leg. I gasped, trying to keep hold of Bailey's leash. She was thrashing, trying to drag me with her. Mom grabbed my arm, yanking me up. "Come on," she hissed. I pushed through the pain and ran. Not a sprint, but fast enough. The truck was still too far. The smell was stronger now, thick and cloying. Bailey whined, nearly choking herself trying to pull ahead. Then the noise stopped, just gone. The forest was silent. I didn't stop to wonder why. I just kept moving, my heart pounding in my ears. Finally, the trailhead came into view. The truck was there, waiting like a lifeline. We scrambled in. Mom locked the doors before she even started the engine. Bailey dove into the back seat, curling up into a tight, trembling ball. I looked out the window, scanning the trees. Still nothing. But I knew without a doubt, that something had been there. Mom peeled out, the tires kicking up gravel. We didn't speak for a while, both of us just trying to breathe. Bailey was still shaking. We never went back to that trail. I never even looked up reports of animal sightings in the area. I didn't want to know. Maybe it was a mountain lion. Maybe it wasn't. But whatever it was, it had followed us. And if Bailey hadn't been there, if we had been alone, I don't think we would have made it back. I don't care what anyone says, animals on military bases are different. Not just a little different, but like they're operating on an entirely separate set of rules from the ones in civilian life. Maybe it's the constant human presence, the noise, the structure, the leftover rations, or the fact that no one can really mess with them. Whatever the reason, they're bolder, smarter, and sometimes downright terrifying. This story takes place in 2012, back when I was stationed at Fort Johnson in Louisiana. It was deep summer, the kind of heat that makes the air feel thick and heavy, where the humidity clings to you like a second skin. We were out in the field for a training exercise, one of those long-haul stretches where you sleep in shifts, eat MREs, and basically exist in a haze of exhaustion and sweat. The kind of miserable experience that somehow makes for the best stories later. Now, if you've never been on a military base in the middle of nowhere, let me paint a picture for you. There's a lot of dense forest, barely any light at night, and the sounds of nature are loud. Crickets, frogs, owls, and something bigger moving just beyond the tree line. You always hear something. Most of the time, it's just deer or wild hogs, but every once in a while, you catch a sound that doesn't quite fit. This particular night, I was on watch duty near our LMTV, which was parked at the edge of our camp. It was one of those old, beat-up trucks that had seen better days. I had my rifle slung across my chest, a half-empty bottle of water next to me, and I was just trying to stay awake. The rest of the guys were either sleeping or half-heartedly joking around near the fire. Then, out of nowhere, I heard rustling, quick, purposeful movements. Not the slow, cautious steps of a deer. Not the skittering of something small like a possum. It was something in between. I turned my head, scanning the darkness, my fingers automatically tightening around my rifle's grip. And then I saw them. Raccoons. But not the kind you see in your backyard digging through trash. These things moved like a damn unit, coordinated, silent, focused. There were at least 6 of them, slipping through the shadows, their eyes catching just enough moonlight to glint as they moved. One of them, bigger than the rest, paused near the LMTV's back hatch, standing on its hind legs like it was checking the lock. I should have said something. I should have kicked the truck, made some noise, scared them off. But I was too busy watching, fascinated by how deliberate they were. I wasn't the only one who noticed either. One of our drill sergeants, a hard-ass named Staff Sergeant Malone, had been dozing in the back of the truck. He must have heard something because all of a sudden, there was a sharp, startled yell from inside the LMTV. A split second later, all hell broke loose. Malone started screaming, loud and panicked, followed by the unmistakable sound of an M4 firing blanks. The first shot cracked through the night, echoing across the trees, and the raccoons scattered. But not in fear, more like a well-executed retreat. I watched as they grabbed whatever they could carry, MREs, snack packs, even a roll of toilet paper, and bolted into the woods, vanishing like ghosts. Malone stumbled out of the LMTV, his face pale, his chest heaving. "Damn things ambushed me," he said, breathless. "Came right up in my face. Little bastards didn't even flinch." I won't lie, I laughed. So did the rest of the guys once they realized what had happened. Seeing a grown man, a hardened drill sergeant, lose his shit over raccoons was the funniest thing we'd seen in weeks. But deep down, something about it stuck with me. Those raccoons weren't scared of us. They weren't just looking for food. They had a plan, a strategy. And they executed it damn near perfectly. For the rest of that field exercise, we kept seeing them. Always at the edge of the tree line, always watching. We started locking up our supplies tighter, but somehow they still got into our stuff. It got to the point where we stopped calling them raccoons and started referring to them as the unit. I don't know what it is about military bases, but the animals there, different, smarter, bolder, and sometimes I think they're just waiting for the right moment to remind us that we're not the ones in charge out there. Not really. It was the summer of 2017 when my wife and I decided to take a camping trip up in the northern part of Minnesota. We'd been camping together for years, but this time we wanted something more remote. A place where we wouldn't be packed in next to loud families with screaming kids or RVs with generators running all night. We found a place on an old forestry road, about 20 miles off the highway. It wasn't completely unknown. There were a couple of fire pits, some half-rotten picnic tables, and 2 outhouses that looked like they hadn't been cleaned in years. We figured it was good enough for a few nights. The first day was perfect. We set up our tent, got a fire going, and spent the evening cooking over the flames, drinking a few beers and watching the stars. No sounds of traffic, no other campers, just us and the quiet of the woods. It was exactly what we wanted. Then the wind started. First, it was just a breeze. Nothing unusual, just rustling the tops of the trees. But as the night went on, it got stronger. By midnight, we had full-on gusts ripping through the campsite. The trees around us were jack pines, tall, thin, and brittle. They swayed violently, their tops bending almost to the point of breaking. I could hear branches cracking somewhere off in the woods. My wife was getting nervous. I tried to play it cool, but I was nervous too. I'd seen what happens when a windstorm hits a pine forest. Trees don't just drop small branches, they come down completely, roots and all. And when one goes, it can take others with it like dominoes. We debated packing up and leaving, but it was already pitch black, and the dirt road leading out was lined with the same unstable trees. If one went down across the road, we'd be trapped anyway. So we did the only thing we could do, we waited. The wind got worse. Our tent, a sturdy 4-season model, was getting flattened every time a strong gust hit it. We abandoned it and sat in the car, hoping for the best. The sound of trees creaking and cracking around us was constant. Every few minutes, we'd hear a loud snap followed by the crash of a tree hitting the ground somewhere in the dark. Around 3 in the morning, the biggest one fell. I don't know how close it was, but it sounded like a freight train crashing through the woods. The ground shook. My wife grabbed my arm, and we both just sat there, waiting for the next one. Somehow, by morning, we were still alive. The wind had died down, but the campsite looked like a war zone. Large branches covered the ground. Our tent was half collapsed, and just 50 feet from where we'd parked, a tree had come down across the road. If it had fallen the other way, it would have crushed our car. We packed up as fast as we could, clearing just enough of the road to get out. That was the last time my wife agreed to camp in a jack pine forest. Another trip, a few years later, was even stranger. This time, I was camping with my best friend, Ryan. We picked a spot in a remote camping area in Montana, a place you could only get to with a high-clearance truck. It wasn't a completely abandoned site, but it was close. Park Service probably checked on it once a year. A couple of rusty fire pits, some ancient picnic tables, and 2 wooden outhouses that looked like they hadn't been touched in a decade. We arrived in the late afternoon and started setting up. Ryan wandered off to check out the outhouses while I got the fire going. A minute later, he came back, looking confused. "Go check out that first one," he said. I assumed it was something gross. Maybe someone had left a mess in there or an animal had gotten trapped and died. But when I opened the door, it wasn't what I expected. There were 3 full backpacks sitting in the corner. Big ones, the kind you'd take on a week-long backcountry trip. I looked around. Nobody was there. No tents, no vehicles, no sign that anyone had been around recently. Curious, we unzipped them. The first 2 were full of regular camping gear, sleeping bags, food, clothes, all high-quality stuff. But the third one was different. It was full of Skittles. Not just a few bags, 80 liters of them. Bulk bags, individual packs, tropical flavors, sour flavors, every variety you could think of. Just pounds and pounds of candy. We stayed for 4 days and never saw another soul. The bags were still there when we left. When we got back to town, we told a park ranger about it. No idea what they did with them. To this day, I have no idea who left them there or why. And honestly, I don't want to know. The scariest experience I ever had camping, though, was when it was just me and my dog. It was supposed to be a quick overnight trip, nothing serious. I wasn't far off the road, maybe a mile, but I had set up a small tarp shelter instead of a tent, just enough to keep off the dew. I had a small fire going, and my dog was curled up next to me. I was just dozing off when I heard it. A truck, ripping up the road nearby. Then voices, loud, drunk, yelling. I didn't think much of it at first. Probably just some guys blowing off steam. But then I heard the first gunshot. Then another. Then another. My blood ran cold. They were close. Too close. I hadn't realized how near I was to a second road, a back entrance to the area. Judging by the sound, they were shooting in my direction. Whether they knew I was there or not, I didn't want to stick around to find out. I grabbed my dog and kept low, making my way back toward my truck as quietly as possible. The shots kept coming, echoing through the trees. I didn't know if they were just shooting at bottles or if they were hunting illegally, but either way, I wasn't about to risk getting caught in the crossfire. By the time I made it back to my truck, my heart was pounding. I loaded my dog, started the engine as quietly as I could, and drove out of there without looking back. I don't know what those guys were doing out there, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. That was the last time I ever camped alone. I spent a lot of time in the woods during my years in the Army. Training exercises, night ops, weeks of living out of a rucksack. Those forests became a second home, whether I wanted them to or not. But there was one time, out in the deep woods of northern Pennsylvania, that still makes my skin crawl. Not because of some ghost story or fairy tale monster. No, this was real. And it was worse because of that. It was 2009, late September. The air was getting crisp, the leaves starting to change, but the days were still warm enough to work up a sweat under all that gear. We were out for a long-range reconnaissance exercise, meaning we had to keep our footprint small. No big fires, no loud talking, no unnecessary movement. Just a small group of us, spread out in the woods, living off MREs and whatever water we could find. I set up my hooch in a little thicket, about 50 meters from the main ORP, objective rally point. Just a poncho stretched between some trees with a sleeping mat underneath. My ruck sat against the base of a tree, body armor resting on top of it, rifle within arm's reach. It was basic, but that was all I needed. Nights out there were always restless. You never really slept, just drifted in and out, ears always half open for anything unusual. The first night, I woke up to the sound of something rustling. Not the wind, not a branch falling, something moving. I froze, keeping my breathing steady, listening. I could hear small, deliberate movements near my ruck. The slow, careful sound of a zipper coming undone. My blood ran cold. I knew raccoons were bold, but this wasn't some random animal just sniffing around. I turned my head slightly, eyes adjusting to the darkness. There, right at my ruck, was a raccoon. Not a little one, either. This thing was big, its fur bristling in the moonlight, beady eyes locked on my pack. It had one paw inside a half-open pouch, tugging something out. I shot up, yelling, slapping my hand against the ground to scare it off. It darted back a few steps but didn't run. Instead, it stopped just outside the reach of my arm and stared at me. Then, as if on cue, I heard more rustling. My stomach dropped. There were more of them. I grabbed my flashlight, flicking it on. The beam caught at least 4 other raccoons, all frozen mid-movement, each one positioned around me and my gear like they'd been following a plan. One was near my rifle. Another had its paws on my body armor. And the worst part? They weren't scrambling away like normal animals. They just stood there, staring. A branch cracked somewhere deeper in the woods. Then, slow as anything, they started backing away, not running, not scurrying. Just retreating, deliberate. And the biggest one, the one that had been rifling through my ruck, was the last to go. It stood there for a second longer, almost like it was thinking. Then it turned and disappeared into the brush. I sat there, heart pounding, gripping my flashlight tight. Eventually, I lay back down, but I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I checked my gear. Sure enough, they'd gotten into my MREs. One of my pouches had been completely unzipped, and half my food was gone. A protein bar wrapper lay on the ground a few feet away, like they hadn't even bothered to take it far. My water canteen had been tipped over, cap loosened but still on. It was like they'd tried to open it but gave up. And my radio? Moved. Not stolen, not broken, just moved a few inches from where I'd left it. I mentioned it to the guys, expecting them to laugh. But one of them, Torres, just nodded. Yeah, he said. "They're smart as hell out here. Seen 'em work together before. Swear they've got a leader or something." I laughed it off, but that night, I was more prepared. I secured everything as best I could, double-checking every zipper, tying things down. I kept my rifle closer just in case, but they came back. This time, I woke up to something tugging at my pocket. Not my ruck, not my vest, my actual pocket. I jolted up and there it was, the same big bastard from the night before. It had one paw on my leg, the other pulling at the flap of my cargo pocket like it knew exactly where the good stuff was. I swatted at it, but instead of running, it just let go and stepped back. And then, again, the others appeared. 5 of them this time, watching, waiting. I grabbed my knife and lunged forward, shouting. That sent them scattering, but not in a panic. More like a tactical retreat. The big one stayed the longest, staring me down before finally slinking off into the trees. The rest of that week, I barely slept. They kept coming back. Not every night, but often enough that I never let my guard down. I'd wake up to the sound of movement, see shadows just beyond my hooch, hear the quiet sound of zippers being undone. It wasn't random. It wasn't instinct. It was something else. Something more. They weren't just looking for food. They were testing me. On the last night, I set a trap. Nothing fancy. Just some scraps tied to a tripwire that would shake a mess tin if disturbed. Sure enough, around 2 a.m., I heard the rattling. I flicked on my light, and there they were again, the leader in front, the others positioned around. But this time, when I sat up, the big one didn't back away immediately. It stood there, looking at me, and I swear, this sounds crazy, but I swear, it nodded, just a little. Then it turned, chittered to the others, and they all disappeared into the woods. I never saw them again after that. Years later, I still think about those nights, about how they moved, how they planned, and about that big one, their leader, their mastermind. Laugh if you want, but I know what I saw. Those raccoons weren't just scavengers. They were organized. And that big bastard, he wasn't just a raccoon. He was something else entirely. My family went camping every summer when I was a kid. It was a tradition, something we all looked forward to, even if some trips were better than others. We never went to the same place twice in a row, but we had a rotation, somewhere in the mountains one year, somewhere near the water the next. That summer, we were at a coastal campground in North Carolina, not far from the ocean. The place was famous for its wild horses, which people always warned us to leave alone. They weren't tame, they weren't friendly, and they weren't there for our entertainment. We knew that, but it didn't stop us from watching them from a distance, fascinated by how they moved in small herds across the dunes. It was late July, and the air felt thick and heavy with humidity. Even at night, the heat clung to us, making it impossible to sleep comfortably. My parents had brought 2 tents, one for them and one for me and my little brother, Sam. Ours was set up a little farther from theirs, near the edge of our campsite. It was a little unsettling being that far from them, especially in the dark, but we were used to it. Sam and I had been sharing a tent for years by then. The day had been long. We swam in the ocean, hiked some of the trails, and ate dinner around the fire as the sun went down. By the time we zipped up our tent and crawled into our sleeping bags, my body felt heavy with exhaustion. The last thing I remember before drifting off was the rhythmic sound of the waves crashing in the distance and the occasional chirp of crickets outside. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The campground was quiet, apart from the usual night sounds. The wind rustling the trees, the distant crash of waves, and the occasional rustle of movement from other campers shifting in their tents. But something felt off. The air inside our tent felt strangely still, like everything outside had paused. Then I noticed my mom. She was sitting up in her tent, visible through the thin fabric, completely still. I could see her silhouette from the light of the moon, but she wasn't moving. It was unsettling, the way she just sat there, staring at something outside. At first, I thought maybe she was just awake, maybe listening to something I hadn't noticed. But then I saw what she was looking at. Just beyond our tent, barely visible in the moonlight, was the figure of an old woman. She was standing still, facing our tent, her hair long and wild, tangled from the wind. My stomach twisted into a knot. She wasn't moving. She wasn't making a sound. She was just watching, couldn't breathe. I tried to convince myself that I was dreaming, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But I could feel my heart pounding, my body frozen in place. I wanted to call out to my mom, but the fear kept my throat closed. I turned towards Sam, but he was still asleep, oblivious to what was happening. Then, I must have made some kind of sound, a sharp breath, a slight shift in my sleeping bag, because the figure moved, fast. It bolted to the side, disappearing into the darkness, and the moment it moved, my mom jerked back as if snapping out of a trance. I heard her rustling in her tent, unzipping the flap just enough to look outside. I did the same, my hands shaking as I pulled down the zipper as quietly as possible. There was nothing there, just the trees, the sand, the shadows cast by the moonlight. My mom turned to look at me across the short distance between our tents, her face unreadable in the dark. I could tell she was shaken, but she didn't say anything. And neither did I. I laid back down, my heart still racing. I wanted to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe some woman from another campsite had wandered too close. Maybe it was a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew neither of those things were true. Morning came slowly. I must have fallen asleep at some point, but when I woke up, my body felt tense, like I hadn't rested at all. The sun was already climbing, the air sticky with early heat. My dad was making coffee over the fire, and Sam was still out cold in his sleeping bag. My mom hadn't mentioned anything to my dad. I could tell. The way she moved around the campsite, acting like everything was normal, told me she didn't want to talk about it, and I didn't either. I almost convinced myself to let it go, to pretend it hadn't happened. But then, as we were packing up our things for the day, I noticed something in the sand just beyond our tents. Hoof prints. A trail of them, leading right past our site, heading toward the beach. My stomach dropped as I followed them with my eyes, my heart hammering all over again. It wasn't an old woman. It had never been an old woman. We had set up our tent directly on one of the horses' trails, and in the middle of the night, one of them had wandered through, probably on its way to the water. The shape, the long tangled hair, the way it had stood there staring at our tent. It had all been an illusion, a trick of the light and my half-asleep brain. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. My mom was standing nearby, looking at the same prints in the sand. We didn't say anything about it, not to each other, not to my dad or Sam. But in that moment, I knew she had been just as scared as I was. We never camped in that spot again. The sky had been heavy all evening. I should have noticed it then. The way the air felt thick and unmoving. How the birds had gone silent long before the sun dipped below the horizon. My siblings and I had set up our campsite along the shores of Black Hollow Lake, a quiet, isolated spot a few miles outside of town. It was a place we'd camped before, always enjoying the peace, the fishing, the way the water looked like glass at dusk. But something about that night was different. Even before the storm came. I remember the wind picking up as we sat around the fire, stirring the flames, sending embers spiraling into the dark. The leaves rustled in the trees above, the sound growing steadily louder, but we ignored it. We checked the weather before coming out. Some rain, maybe a little wind, nothing serious. We had no idea what was coming. By the time we climbed into the tent, the air had turned electric. The first rumble of thunder was so deep I felt it in my chest, followed by a crack of lightning so bright it turned the whole world white for a second. Then another, and another. The sky was alive with it, jagged bolts branching across the clouds, flickering and pulsing like a living thing. It was mesmerizing and terrifying all at once. The wind howled, tearing through the trees. The fabric of the tent flapped wildly, snapping back and forth, and with every gust, the stakes groaned in the dirt. We could hear the lake churning, waves slapping against the shore, the rain pelting down in sheets. Then, a gust so strong the whole tent lifted a few inches off the ground, yanking at the stakes. That's when we knew. We scrambled, grabbing whatever we could. Phones, flashlights, shoes, before throwing ourselves into the storm, running for the car. The rain hit like needles against my skin. The wind so strong I had to fight to stay upright. Another flash of lightning lit up the campground, and in that brief second, I saw our tent collapse, folding in on itself before being ripped away, tumbling end over end until it caught in the branches of a nearby tree. We threw ourselves into the car, slamming the doors shut, gasping, dripping. The wind rocked the vehicle violently, rain hammering the roof and windows. I gripped the steering wheel out of instinct, as if I could somehow keep the car steady. The storm didn't let up. If anything, it grew worse. The thunder never stopped, a constant, rolling growl that seemed to shake the ground. The lightning was relentless, striking the lake over and over, making the water glow like molten silver. We sat there, breathing hard, hearts hammering, watching the campground get torn apart around us. Branches snapped and crashed to the ground. Leaves and debris whipped through the air. We debated staying, waiting it out, but when the car shook so violently that it felt like it might flip, the decision was made for us. I started the engine, barely able to see through the downpour. The headlights cut through the rain, illuminating the road just enough to keep moving. Trees bent and swayed dangerously on either side of us, and more than once, I had to swerve to avoid fallen branches. The drive was slow, agonizingly slow, but after what felt like an eternity, we made it to my grandfather's house, stumbling inside, dripping wet and shaking. That night, the storm raged on. Even inside, we could hear it, the wind screaming past the windows, the rain hammering the roof. But at least we were safe. The next morning, we returned to the campsite. The devastation was worse than we'd imagined. Trees had fallen across roads, branches littered the ground, and part of the campground was blocked off. A small tornado had touched down in the area. Whether it happened while we were still there or after we left, we weren't sure. But it had been close. Too close. We picked through the wreckage of our campsite, gathering what we could. The tent was tangled in the trees, shredded beyond repair. Our chairs were gone. The cooler was upside down, half buried in mud, and my sleeping bag completely gone. Vanished, as if it had never been there at all. We packed up in silence, still shaken, still trying to process what had happened. I had never experienced a storm like that before, never felt that kind of fear, that raw, helpless panic as nature unleashed its full force around us. And I never wanted to again. The year was 2013. My buddy Kyle and I had been making these deep woods camping trips a tradition for the past 5 years. We loved pushing ourselves, hiking miles down unmarked trails, carrying only what we needed on our backs. There was something about being so far from civilization that made the world feel different, quieter, more primal. This trip was no different except for how it ended. We had picked a spot deep in the Alabama wilderness, near the Talladega National Forest. The air was cool but comfortable during the day, perfect for a long hike. The terrain was rough, a mix of steep inclines and uneven forest floor covered in pine needles and fallen leaves. It had been a dry season, and we could hear the crunch of our boots with every step. We set up camp just before sundown. The sky was turning from blue to that deep orange glow, the kind that makes everything look warm even as the temperature starts to dip. Our tent was nestled between 2 thick oak trees, a small clearing giving us just enough space for a fire pit and some logs to sit on. By the time night fully settled in, the temperature had dropped dramatically. It wasn't gradual, it was sudden, like the heat had been sucked out of the air. 1 minute, we were comfortable, and the next, our breath was fogging up in front of us. Neither of us had expected it to get this cold. We had packed for autumn, not winter, and while we had decent sleeping bags, the sharp drop into the low 20s was going to make for a rough night. We got a solid fire going, though, and that made all the difference. We cooked up some simple meals, jerky, beans, and some bread we had packed. Nothing fancy, but enough to fill our stomachs. With the warmth of the fire and the weight of a full meal settling in, exhaustion hit fast. The forest was still. That kind of stillness you only get deep in the woods, where there's no highway hum or distant city sounds. The fire crackled, the only noise breaking up the silence. I lay on my back, wrapped in my sleeping bag, staring up at the stars. The cold air felt sharp in my nose, but the fire's heat kept me comfortable. Slowly, my eyes got heavier, and soon enough, I was out. I woke up to something tapping my foot. At first, I thought it was a dream, but then I felt it again, something nudging at my boot. My eyes snapped open. Kyle was crouched near me, a stick in his hand, his face barely visible in the dim firelight. He didn't say a word, just gave a slow nod toward the fire. That's when I saw them. 2 wild boars, standing barely 15 feet from us, their thick bodies illuminated by the dying firelight. They were kicking up dirt, snorting, their dark eyes reflecting the faint glow of the embers. One was bigger than the other, but both were massive, easily over 150 pounds each. Their bodies were covered in coarse, bristly hair, their tusks gleaming slightly as they shifted and moved. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. Wild boars weren't like deer or raccoons. They didn't startle and bolt at the first sign of humans. They were aggressive, territorial, and unpredictable. If one of us made the wrong move, if they decided we were a threat, we'd be in serious trouble. We had no rifles, no bows, not even a decent hunting knife within arm's reach. The only weapon we had was a small hand axe, and it was sitting next to our packs about 10 feet away, completely useless to us now. Kyle and I didn't move. We barely breathed. The boars paced around the fire, sniffing, grunting, their hooves scuffing against the dirt. I could see their breath fogging up in the cold air. Every second felt stretched out, my muscles aching from the tension of staying still. They stayed for what felt like an eternity, circling, snorting, their ears flicking at every small sound in the night. My mind ran through every possible outcome. If they charged, could we roll away fast enough? Climb a tree? No, the trees around us were thick, no low branches. Running was pointless. Boars could outrun humans easily. We were at their mercy. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they lost interest. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, offering little light or warmth. Without so much as a final glance, they turned and disappeared into the dark woods, their heavy bodies rustling through the underbrush. We listened until the sound of their movements faded completely. Only then did I finally exhale. Kyle sat back, rubbing his hands over his face. Neither of us spoke for a long time. There wasn't much to say. We had been lucky, stupidly, incredibly lucky. If one of us had coughed, shifted, or made the wrong sound, things could have gone very differently. The fire was nearly out, but neither of us dared to get up and stoke it right away. We just sat there, wide awake now, listening to the sounds of the forest. The night felt different, less peaceful, more hostile, like we had been reminded in the most brutal way that out here we weren't at the top of the food chain. We didn't sleep much after that. The cold felt sharper now, biting at my skin even through my sleeping bag. Every little noise made my heart jump, my ears straining to pick up any sign that the boars had come back. They didn't, but the fear lingered. First light, we packed up quickly. The idea of staying another night out here didn't sit right with either of us anymore. The woods, which had felt so inviting just a day before, now felt like something else entirely. Wild, indifferent, something that tolerated us just long enough before reminding us of our place. We hiked back faster than we had hiked in, not talking much, just moving. When we finally made it back to the truck, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It wasn't until we were back on paved roads, back in civilization, that I finally let out a long breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. We still camp. We still hike deep into the woods, miles away from anyone else. But we always bring a rifle now, because that night, the only thing that kept us safe was pure luck, and luck runs out. I had been planning this camping trip for months. It was the middle of June, and the heat in Florida was the kind that stuck to your skin, thick and heavy. I was used to it, though. Born and raised in the South, I knew how to handle the humidity. The key was to embrace it, not fight it. A few buddies and I had driven out to Sewanee Springs, a place famous for its clear water and deep caves. People came from all over to dive, swim, and just escape the noise of their daily lives. It was the kind of place that felt untouched, even though it was a popular spot. The trees were tall, towering oaks and cypress that had been there long before any of us had. Their roots snaked out of the earth like veins, twisting and curling into the soft ground. We set up camp near the river, about a 10-minute walk from the main road. There were a few other groups scattered around, but it wasn't packed. That's what I liked about this place. It never felt crowded, even in the summer. After setting up our tents, we spent most of the day in the water, letting the cold rush over our sunburned skin. By the time the sun started dipping below the tree line, we were exhausted. We built a fire, cooked up some hot dogs, and drank a couple of beers. Nothing crazy, just enough to relax. The sound of the river mixed with the distant laughter of other campers, blending into the steady hum of the forest. Crickets, cicadas, the occasional hoot of an owl. The kind of sounds that make you feel like you're part of something bigger, something ancient. I remember looking up at the trees as the fire crackled, thinking about how they had stood there for hundreds of years. Some of them had probably survived hurricanes, lightning strikes, and floods. They had roots so deep they seemed indestructible. That thought stuck with me. Sometime after midnight, I crawled into my tent, zipped it shut, and lay on my back, staring at the thin fabric above me. It was warm, too warm, but I was too tired to care. The sounds of the forest faded into the background, and my mind drifted. I was just on the edge of sleep when I heard it. A crack, sharp and sudden, then another, and then an explosion of sound so loud and so deep it rattled my chest. It was the kind of sound you only hear in movies. A tree breaking, but not just a branch or a limb. This was something massive. The air itself seemed to shake as the sound grew, stretching on for what felt like forever. And then silence. For a moment, I didn't move. I wasn't even sure I had heard it right. My brain struggled to catch up, trying to put the pieces together. I had never heard a tree fall before, not like that. It didn't seem real. I told myself it was normal. Trees fall all the time. Maybe it was rotten. Maybe it had been struck by lightning days ago, and it had just now given way. I almost convinced myself it wasn't worth thinking about. But then I heard the voices, muffled at first, low and urgent, then more of them, more people, more sounds. I unzipped my tent just enough to peek out. The fire was still burning, casting long shadows through the trees. A few flashlights flickered in the distance. I could hear movement, footsteps, people talking. Not laughing, not casual conversation. Something was wrong. I crawled out of my tent and stood up, still groggy, still half asleep. I followed the sound, moving toward where the voices were coming from. As I got closer, I saw the people gathered around something. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, bouncing off the trees, the leaves, and then I saw it. The tree. It was massive, thicker than a car, and it had fallen straight onto a tent. A tent just like mine. Everything in me went cold. The fabric was crushed under the weight, barely visible beneath the bark and leaves. The ground around it was torn up, roots pulled from the earth like exposed nerves. The smell of fresh wood filled the air. Someone was saying something, but I wasn't listening. My eyes were locked on the tent. There was someone inside. Someone who had been sleeping just like me. Someone who had zipped themselves in for the night, thinking they were safe, thinking they had nothing to worry about. I don't know how long I stood there. The voices around me faded in and out. Someone called for help. Someone else was trying to move the branches. Then I saw a hand, pale, motionless, sticking out from under the fabric. Everything after that felt distant, like I wasn't really there. Someone tried to move the tree, but it was useless. It was too heavy, too massive. Sirens in the distance, a helicopter, people talking, their voices hushed, like they didn't want to accept what had happened. By the time the paramedics arrived, it was too late. I didn't know them, but I didn't have to. That could have been me. Could have been any of us. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Neither did most of the people around me. We sat by the fire, barely speaking, just staring into the flames. The sounds of the forest, once comforting, now felt different, heavier. The next morning, I packed up my tent in silence. No one said much. What was there to say? The drive home was long and quiet. The trees lining the highway looked different now. Less like guardians, more like something waiting. It's been years since that night, but I still think about it. I still hear the sound in my head, that deep, breaking groan, the moment before the fall. And I know, no matter how strong a tree looks, no matter how deep its roots go, it can still come down. And sometimes it takes someone with it. The air was crisp that morning, the kind of cold that settles deep in your bones and makes you wish you had stayed curled up in your sleeping bag just a little longer. The fire from the night before had long since died, leaving only the scent of charred wood lingering in the damp forest air. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that only exists in places untouched by civilization. No hum of distant traffic, no murmur of human voices. Just the wind in the trees, the occasional splash of water from the lake, and the rustle of unseen creatures moving through the underbrush. I was still half asleep when I first heard it. Just a soft rustling at first, barely enough to register in my groggy mind. My first thought was that it was just the wind shifting through the branches, or maybe a squirrel nosing around in search of an easy meal. But then it grew louder, heavy, more deliberate, a sound that didn't belong to the normal movements of the wilderness. It was close, too close. I sat up, the cold seeping through my clothes as I tried to shake off the last remnants of sleep. The tent was dimly lit, the pale light of early morning filtering through the fabric, casting long shadows along the walls. My wife stirred beside me, muttering something incoherent before turning over, still lost in sleep. I hesitated, listening. The sound came again, closer this time. A deep, rustling shuffle, the unmistakable noise of something large moving through the brush just outside the tent. I reached for the zipper of my sleeping bag, ready to investigate, when suddenly, without warning, the entire side of the tent collapsed inward. Heavy weight pressed down on me, pinning me against the cold ground. My first instinct was to fight, to shove, to kick, to thrash against the thing crushing me. But it was gone as quickly as it had come. The weight lifted, the fabric of the tent snapping back into place. I scrambled upright, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. My wife was sitting up now too, eyes wide with confusion. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then I fumbled with the zipper of the tent, hands shaking from the sudden rush of adrenaline. The flap came free, and I shoved it open, blinking against the harsh light of morning. 10 feet away, standing in the clearing, was a black bear. It wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at the tent with what I can only describe as pure, dumbfounded confusion. Its dark eyes flicked between us and the now tilted structure of our tent, its head cocked slightly to one side, as if trying to piece together exactly what had just happened. For a long moment, none of us moved. Then, without thinking, I let out a sharp yell. A wordless sound, something primal, instinctive. My wife joined in, our voices breaking the stillness of the morning. The bear flinched, took a step backward, hesitated. I yelled again, louder this time, raising my arms in a feeble attempt to make myself look bigger. The bear let out a soft huff, then turned and bolted, crashing through the underbrush and disappearing into the dense forest beyond. We sat there for a long time, the only sound now the rapid beating of our own hearts. The tent was partially collapsed, one side buckled inward where the bear had fallen against it. I exhaled slowly, feeling the tremor in my hands as I ran them over my face. Took a while before we pieced it together. The bear must have been foraging in the thick brush behind the tent, looking for berries or roots, when it lost its balance. Maybe it stepped on an unstable patch of earth, or maybe it leaned too far forward reaching for something. Either way, it had fallen, right onto the side of our tent. For a brief moment, I had been pinned under the weight of a full-grown black bear. And then, just as quickly, it had recovered, startled itself just as much as it had startled us, and backed away. The rest of the day passed in a strange, jittery haze. We packed up camp soon after, deciding we'd had enough excitement for one trip. The wilderness was beautiful, but at that moment, I craved the comforting presence of walls, of civilization, of a place where things didn't fall on you in the middle of the night. Later, when telling the story, we laughed about it. About the way the bear had looked at us, about the sheer absurdity of the situation. But at the time, it hadn't been funny. It had been the kind of moment that leaves your hands shaking, your breath coming fast and shallow, your brain working overtime to convince itself that everything is fine now, that the danger is gone. And yet, sometimes, even now, I find myself waking up in the middle of the night to the phantom weight of something pressing down on me, the fleeting memory of that morning lingering in the quiet darkness. The cold had settled deep into my bones by the time I finally fell asleep. I was used to the chill of winter nights out here in the bush, but this one seemed to cut sharper than most. It was the kind of cold that made your fingers feel brittle, made your breath hang heavy in the air like smoke. I was camped out in the middle of nowhere, miles away from the nearest town. Just me, my buddy Mark, and the endless stretch of the African wilderness. We had been tracking a small pride of lions for the past few days, documenting their movement patterns for a conservation project. Nights like these were common, setting up camp wherever we found a safe spot before darkness swallowed the land. The fire had burned down to embers when I finally crawled into my tent, wrapping myself tightly in my sleeping bag to fight off the biting air. Sometime in the night, I woke up to warmth against my back. It was a welcome sensation at first, my tired mind registering it as part of a dream, but as I stirred slightly, I felt it, a weight pressing against the canvas of my tent. Something warm, something solid. My first thought was that Mark had gotten up and stumbled into my tent in his sleep. But no, there was no shuffling of a sleeping bag, no soft murmur of breath inside my tent apart from my own. My mind worked sluggishly, still heavy with sleep, but my instincts were starting to fire awake. I could feel the presence outside the thin fabric, the slow, steady rise and fall of something breathing, something alive. The realization hit me like ice water. It was an animal, a big one. My body locked up. I held my breath, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. I lay completely still, terrified that any movement might startle whatever was pressed against me. It was warm, radiating heat through the thin material of my tent, and it wasn't moving much, just resting there. But even without seeing it, I could tell it was big. I tried to think, to work through the situation logically, but my thoughts were sluggish. What animal would do this? A lion? A leopard? But leopards didn't usually rest like this, and a lion, God, if it was a lion, I was already too close. My breathing was shallow, barely there, as if even that small movement might be enough to make it react. Then I heard it, a voice, a hushed whisper cutting through the silence. Theo, are you awake? Mark's voice, unsteady, tight with something I didn't like. My first instinct was to answer, to reassure him, to ask what the hell was happening. But then I remembered. An animal was pressed up against my back. It hadn't moved yet. Maybe it was asleep. Maybe it hadn't noticed me. Maybe I still had a chance to get through this without it turning into something worse. But then, like an idiot, I spoke. Yeah. The moment the word left my mouth, the weight against my back shifted. The warmth disappeared, replaced by cold air rushing in as the animal got to its feet. A deep, heavy exhale, followed by the sound of paws crunching softly against the dry grass. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I just listened as it padded away, the sound growing fainter, swallowed by the vast, dark wilderness around me. Only when I could no longer hear it did I let out a shaky breath. My entire body was tense, my muscles burning from how rigidly I had been holding myself. I turned onto my back, staring up at the ceiling of my tent, my mind still trying to catch up with what had just happened. Mark was silent in his tent. I wanted to speak, to ask him if he had seen anything, but neither of us said a word. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. The morning light brought a thin layer of frost over the grass, the air still carrying the crisp bite of the night before. Mark and I sat by the remnants of our fire, hands wrapped around cups of coffee, neither of us saying much at first. The weight of last night still lingered, thick and unspoken. I finally broke the silence. "Did you see it?" Mark hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Yeah." He didn't elaborate at first, just stared into his coffee. I waited, my own mind still piecing things together. "It was a hyena," he finally said, voice quiet. "Big one." I exhaled sharply, shaking my head. Damn. Hyenas weren't usually known for getting that close to humans, especially not in the middle of the night. They were scavengers, opportunists, but they didn't typically seek out direct contact like that. Mark looked up at me, something uneasy in his eyes. I woke up and saw it standing right outside my tent. It was sniffing around, looking toward you. He hesitated. I think it was trying to get inside. A chill crawled up my spine. I had been one thin layer of fabric away from a wild animal curling up next to me for warmth. If it had been desperate enough, it might have tried to push its way in. And if I had reacted the wrong way, if I had moved too fast or made the wrong sound, it could have ended very differently. Neither of us had much of an appetite that morning. We packed up camp quickly, our usual routine feeling heavier than normal. The wilderness was unpredictable, we both knew that. But this had been different. Too close, too personal. As we drove away from the site, I caught one last glimpse of our abandoned campsite in the rearview mirror. Just another patch of grass, another night in the wild. But I knew I'd never forget it. When I was younger, about 15 or so, my family used to camp at a state park every summer. It was a tradition, one of those things that felt like it had been going on forever, even if, in reality, it had only been a few years. My best friend, Jake, would always come with us. We grew up together, living just a few houses apart, and spent every possible moment outside, exploring, pushing our limits. One thing we always did during these trips was go for night walks. We called it the ritual. Every night after my parents and younger siblings had gone to bed, Jake and I would slip away from the campfire, our flashlights tucked into our pockets but rarely used. We liked the challenge of navigating by moonlight, of letting our eyes adjust to the darkness, of feeling like we were the only two people in the world. The park was big, with winding trails and thick woods that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. Most nights, we stuck to the familiar paths, looping around near the campsites, sometimes going as far as the lake before heading back. But on this particular night, we decided to push further. We weren't reckless. We had a good sense of direction, and we knew these woods well enough to avoid getting lost. The air was thick and warm, the kind of humidity that clung to your skin. The moon was out, though mostly hidden behind shifting clouds. The only sounds were the crunching of our boots on the dirt path and the occasional rustling of animals in the underbrush. About half a mile from the nearest campsite, we heard something behind us, a soft whispering. We stopped. The sound had been faint, barely distinguishable from the usual noises of the woods. Could have been the wind, could have been an animal, but it didn't quite fit. Without thinking, we both yanked out our flashlights and spun around, the beams cutting through the darkness. Nothing. The trees stood still, their shadows stretching long in the artificial light. The trail behind us was empty. Jake let out a nervous chuckle. "Probably just the wind," he said, but he sounded less sure than he wanted to. I nodded, even though something about the sound had felt too deliberate, too human. We kept walking a little faster this time. Neither of us wanted to admit we were spooked, but we were. And then we heard it again. A whisper, low and urgent, coming from somewhere close. We stopped cold. My heart hammered. The sound wasn't coming from the trees, it was on the path. Behind us, Jake raised his flashlight again, and this time we saw her. A woman. She was crawling on the ground, moving slowly, whispering random, disjointed words. Her clothes were dark, almost blending in with the dirt. and she was covered in dust and leaves, like she had been rolling around on the forest floor. Her hair hung in tangled strands around her face, and as our lights hit her, she flinched, squinting against the brightness. For a few long seconds, neither of us moved. Then slowly she got to her feet. She wavered, unsteady, her arms hanging limply at her sides. She blinked at us, her expression empty at first, then shifting into something almost desperate. "I'm looking for my campsite," she said. Her voice was slurred, and up close, we could see how disoriented she was. Her pupils were huge, her movements sluggish. I exchanged a glance with Jake, and he gave me a tiny nod. We weren't dealing with something supernatural. We were dealing with someone who was very, very high. For a second, I thought she might collapse again, but she stayed upright, swaying slightly. Jake cleared his throat. "Which campsite?" She opened her mouth, then closed it, shook her head. "Don't remember." I swallowed hard, my adrenaline still buzzing. "Okay, let's get you back to the campground. We'll figure it out." She nodded, like it was the best idea she'd ever heard, and we started walking. The walk back was tense. The woman mumbled to herself the entire time, but nothing she said made sense. Just fragments of sentences, like half-formed thoughts escaping her mouth. "So dark. Can't find it. Needed to pee. Lost the shoes." She kept glancing around like she expected something to jump out at her. I kept a few steps ahead, shining my flashlight toward the campsites in the distance. The closer we got, the safer I felt, but my mind was still racing. Where had she even come from? How long had she been out here? When we reached the main campground, it took a while to find her group. We asked a few people if they recognized her, but no one did. Finally, we walked her past a group sitting around a dying fire, and one of the guys sat up, squinting. "Holy shit, Vanessa?" The woman, Vanessa, I guess, blinked slowly. "I was looking for the bathroom." The guy shook his head, rubbing his face. "Dude, we thought you were in your tent." He stood up, grabbing her by the arm. "How the hell did you end up all the way out there?" She just mumbled something in response. The guy sighed and looked at us. "Sorry about this." "Yep. Thanks for bringing her back." We nodded and walked away. When we got back to our tent, neither of us spoke for a long time. I lay awake for hours, staring at the canvas ceiling, listening to the quiet murmurs of the campground. I kept thinking about the whispering, about the way she had crawled across the dirt like some broken thing. If we hadn't gone that far into the woods that night, I don't know how long she would have been out there. I don't know what would have happened to her. The next morning, her group packed up and left. I never saw her again. But even now, years later, I still think about her sometimes. About the way she moved, the way her voice barely formed words, and about how, if we hadn't heard her whispering, she might have never been found at all. I always loved camping. There was something about sleeping under the stars, hearing the sounds of the wild at night, and waking up to the damp smell of earth that made me feel alive. My ex, Jake, and I shared a birthday, which made it an easy excuse to pack up our gear and head out every year. We had a tradition, 4 nights at Sewanee Springs, a remote but beautiful spot in northern Florida, right along the river. This particular trip in 2012 would be our 4th time celebrating there. We arrived late in the afternoon, the sun already making its slow descent toward the tree line. The air was thick and humid, typical for Florida in July. We set up camp quickly, pitching our tent in the same spot we always did, near a cluster of pines that gave just enough cover from the main dirt path. There weren't many other campers around. A few people had set up down by the river, but for the most part, we were alone. Just how we liked it. The first night went smoothly. We cooked over the fire, drank a few beers, and sat listening to the cicadas scream their endless summer song. By midnight, we crawled into the tent, exhausted but happy. The heat made sleep difficult, but eventually we both drifted off. The second night was different. We were sitting by the fire when we first heard it, distant but clear. A scream, not human, not something you'd expect in these woods. It was high-pitched, drawn out, almost like a woman wailing in pain. It sent a chill down my spine despite the warm night air. Jake and I both sat up, staring into the darkness beyond the firelight. Then came the growling. Low, angry. It had a depth to it that made my gut twist. It sounded close, too close. My first thought was a mountain lion. They weren't common in this area, but they weren't unheard of either. I turned off my flashlight, relying on the glow of the fire to keep our surroundings visible. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it. We waited, listening, but nothing moved beyond the thick brush. After what felt like forever, we put out the fire and climbed into the tent, zipping it up tight. The sounds continued, the screaming and growling, shifting around us, like whatever was out there was pacing the perimeter of our sight. Jake gripped my wrist. I could feel the sweat on his palm. Neither of us moved. We just lay there listening. Minutes passed, then more. The growls grew softer, more like a grumble, and the screaming turned into these sharp little yelps. My mind was racing. Was it a fight? Was something being hunted? The sounds were too violent, too guttural, too much like something dying. My skin crawled with fear, but finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I sat up slowly, careful not to make too much noise. My hands were shaking as I reached for my phone, using the faint glow to find the top of the tent. Our tent had a mesh ceiling, covered only by a thin rainfly. I pushed up on it gently, just enough to peek through the mesh. The night sky was cloudless, the stars bright, but just beyond the edge of our tent, barely illuminated by the moonlight, I saw them. A cat, a regular old house cat, tail puffed up, back arched, ears pinned flat against its skull, and in front of it an armadillo. The little armored creature stood frozen, its small, dark eyes locked onto the cat. They weren't fighting. They were locked in some bizarre standoff, as if both were too stubborn to back down. I blinked. My body was still coursing with adrenaline, my mind struggling to make sense of it. The awful screaming, the deep growling. I had convinced myself we were about to be mauled by something much bigger, much deadlier. But it was just a damn cat and an armadillo, neither willing to break eye contact. Jake whispered, "What do you see?" I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. "You're not gonna believe me." We watched for a few more minutes, but the standoff remained. Finally, the armadillo shuffled forward a few inches, and the cat let out another unearthly scream, its body going rigid. That was enough for the armadillo. It spun around and bolted into the brush, vanishing into the night. The cat, satisfied with its victory, flicked its tail and trotted off in the opposite direction. I collapsed back down into the sleeping bag, my pulse still racing. I really thought we were about to die. Jake exhaled a quiet laugh. Yeah, me too. We lay there for a while, listening to the now quiet forest. The fear had been real, the tension suffocating. Even knowing what had actually happened, my body didn't immediately relax. It took a long time for my heartbeat to slow, and even longer to fall asleep. The next morning, as we packed up our gear, we laughed about it. The irrational fear, the overreaction, the way our minds had twisted the situation into something terrifying. But deep down, I knew I wouldn't forget that night. The way the sounds had slithered through the trees, the way the darkness had felt suffocating. Fear is strange like that. It doesn't always need a real threat to take hold. Sometimes it just needs the unknown. We never went back to Sewanee Springs after that. Not because of what happened, but because life took us in different directions. Still, every now and then, when I find myself in the woods, I think about that night. The scream, the growling, and the absurd, hilarious, terrifying truth of it all. And even now, I can't help but shiver.